I'm gonna go ahead and say this up front. Harassing people is wrong, and harassing performers for the roles they play or harassing people for making decisions in a story is utterly inane. Even if The Last of Us Part 2 was the worst game ever made, the treatment that Laura Bailey, Ashley Johnson, and co have received is absolutely unacceptable and horrific. Yes, this is a video detailing my opinions on what I don't like very much about this game, but if you're looking for a swarm of hatred and bigotry, I suggest you look elsewhere. Might I suggest looking in your local therapist's office? I think you could find what you're looking for there. Also, we're gonna spoil the absolute shit out of The Last of Us Part 2. If you haven't played it, beware all ye who enter here. Lastly, I have a sneaking suspicion a few people might actually watch this episode because it's topical. Your perspective of this game is as valuable as mine, unless you hate it for having women and trans people in it, in which case you won't like this channel anyway, so you should probably turn back now. Cool? Cool. Now let's try and fix one of the highest reviewed games of all time that I think is not that great actually, because that makes me interesting somehow. The Last of Us Part 2, 2020's most controversial game for some reason, has a lot of ideas, probably to the detriment of the final product. It delves on themes of forgiveness, revenge, violence, family, and identity, as well as a host of others. But I would argue that the most interesting topic the game raises is this idea of being a protagonist. To the point where the one thing in the game seems completely devout and raising with no caveats is that being a protagonist does not have the value we as an audience have been trained to think that it has. The game opens on the first game's protagonist, Joel Miller, 4 years after he decided to execute a series of Firefly doctors to save his surrogate daughter Ellie, who would have to die in order for her immunity to be turned into a vaccine that could ostensibly save this dying world. He's in a community, he's happy with Ellie, even if she's not particularly happy with him, and then let's just say the game turns into Mario Golf Toadstool Tour for a moment. The morally gray protagonist of the first game just had his head bashed in. He does not have plot armor, nor a graceful death. Just because we played him, just because he was the protagonist, it didn't change a damn thing. The actual scene itself aside, this moment is exciting and palpable. Similarly to the early seasons of something like Game of Thrones, the realization that the audience avatars have no more value to the world of the text than anybody else is truly thrilling. So then we become Ellie. She's grown a lot darker in the years since she was our hope for the future datification thing. She's a woman and a character in her own right. She's discovered her sexuality, she has hopes, interests, and fears, and she has a mission. She wants to kill the young woman Abby who slaughtered her surrogate dad. Easy stuff, cut and dry. Ellie loses her humanity along the way, becomes who she's trying to destroy, comes to grips with Joel's death, and learns a lesson or two along the way. Wash your hands of it, 82 on Metacritic, and I have some time left over to play more of that Picross game that I really like. But, and this is to the game's start credit, this road is not taken. It starts like this. The first act of the game is more or less what you would expect, with Ellie taking a 3-day journey through a destroyed Seattle to seek vengeance. But just as the drama is revving up, we stop. And then we play through these 3 days as Abby. We meet characters we just shot, we understand this fortified and united community that has played villain for the first 8 or so hours, and we grow to empathize with the young woman who was seeking vengeance the same as us. You see, Abby's dad was the head Firefly doctor who not only made the difficult decision to kill Ellie, but was killed in kind by Joel at the end of the last game. And Joel's was the culmination of a 4-year-long journey for blood to be paid in kind. So you play through these 3 days as Abby, dealing with the various people and interpersonal conflicts she encounters along the way, all the time hearing of the lingering threat of someone taking out waves and waves of your people. And you end these chapters with a fantastic boss fight against Ellie. It's tense, emotional, and overall riveting. A lot of the Abby stuff shines in the game, but here, playing as a new character against the presumed hero of not just the story but the franchise as a whole is exceptional. Abby wins the fight, is about to kill Ellie, but from some wholesome intervention from the young boy Lev who's joined her, decides to cut the cycle of violence and let her and her girlfriend Dina go free. It's a little schmaltzy, but it's a powerful moment of grace to combat the brutality of the rest of the game. There are a good number of things to criticize here, sure, but when the game flashes forward to Ellie, Dina, and their child on a farm, living away from all the chaos and nonsense, it's hard not to get emotional. It leaves the door open for what's to come. It's a lovely button to end the game on, and it tells a compelling, if slighter, story that nicely complements the first game's overarching theme. And then we do it again. Here's where my biggest issue with The Last of Us Part 2 starts to rear its ugly head. Ellie, having been given a new lease on life from the woman who was a second away from slicing the throat of her pregnant girlfriend in retaliation, throws all this away to repeat what she failed at in the first 2/3 of the game. It's a needless denouement that just... Because I'm pretentious, so I pronounce denouement like it's a French word because it is. Blah, blah. It's a needless denouement that just feels tacked on to add some more misery and grandiose action, bringing in a new faction to fight, making the whole game feel both far too rushed and overly bloated. When Ellie rescues Abby from some bad group, it's never really explained, only to force her to a deathmatch in the water that only lets up when Ellie has a very convenient Joel flashback that forces her to offer Abby the same grace that was offered to her previously, and the game finally ends. And this is weird, right? While the first 2 acts don't make a perfect game, they nicely show 2 sides to the same story, bouncing back and forth between these 2 women who are, somewhat annoyingly, extremely similar. There are a lot of themes of the effects of violence with this idea of your enemies in games having lives and dreams of their own prevailing. It makes for some wild dissonance when the bulk of the gameplay is still rampantly killing strangers, but that's for another time. I'm not just here to explain the plot or even review The Last of Us Part 2, I have a little more purpose than that. For the record, 6.5 out of 10. But to fully grasp it, we need to detour a bit. We'll come back to the stuff in a minute. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960s slasher Psycho was a pioneer of a lot of different ideas, but one of its strongest ones is the idea that being a protagonist did not look like we thought it did. The marketing of the film heavily pushed Janet Leigh's performance as Marion Crane. She's the biggest picture on the poster, and the first 30 minutes almost exclusively follow her story as a secretary who, on a whim, steals thousands of dollars from her employer and goes on the run. A few days later, she is murdered by Norman Bates, and the movie shifts. It becomes about Norman, the sympathetic, deranged killer beholden to a visage of his dead mother. There's a moment shortly after the murder when the true protagonist of the film, Norman, places the young woman we thought was the lead in the trunk of the car, pushing it into a lake to dispose of the body. At this point, the audience doesn't know Norman was the murderer, but we know he's covering it up. For a brief moment, the car stops about halfway into the water. As an audience member, this moment stills you. He's not going to get away with this. The car will be found. Why do I want the car to dip into the water? Oh no, I relate to him. This revelation comes not only from the stellar writing and Anthony Perkins' performance, but by his place as the central figure of the story. If a character is a protagonist, the audience will empathize with them in a way they can't often explain, because the brain is designed to like things the more we interact with them. It's why Breaking Bad and The Sopranos became such smash hits. They couldn't make us hate their heroes if they tried, and anyone trying to stop their crime sprees are seen as deterrents to their life, and by extension, the vitality of the story itself. It's why I don't buy the idea that a film like Joker properly interrogates its lead character. The movie is not about the effects that Arthur Fleck has on the world. First and foremost, it is about him and seen through his eyes. Humans are stupid. We like whoever we're forced to follow. Even if they are scum, even if they have no redeeming value, they're the protagonist. Any writer worth their salt will give the protagonist a reason for doing what they do. Being a protagonist means making decisions that further the plot along in a meaningful way. So who is the protagonist of The Last of Us Part 2? The marketing wants us to say Ellie, and the first and final major decisions of the game after the inciting incident are her decisions to make, going after and sparing Abby respectively, but the game seems to have bones to pick with the very idea that stories have to have protagonists in the traditional sense, and the people who expect that from a story. Viewing the game through this thematic lens, the Abby section of the game mostly exists to make the audience think of Ellie as less of a protagonist, that the two characters share both the spotlight and the empathy. And this doesn't totally work for me. It throws off the balance, less a case of both women having top billing in a game populated entirely by second fiddles, but rather the game not being long enough or deep enough in its story to offer complete pictures of either character in the same way that the first game offered a complete picture of Joel, which sucks because I do think that both of these characters have more meat on them than Joel did. And now the thought experiment begins. Changing as little of the game's plot as possible, is there a way to restructure the game in order to make this thematic through line work more for me? First, we need to pretend that there is no third game in sight. We don't know if Naughty Dog is thinking about putting together The Lastest of Us, so let's presume not, that the ending of this game is the ending of the series altogether. Therefore, I think the best course of action is to pitch in the marketing that this game is less of a direct sequel and more of a side story following Abby. Her faction is traveling through the snow in search of a target. We don't know who the target is, we just know it's the person that killed Abby's father. We experience all of the interpersonal conflict seen in her story. We grow to love her as the new face of this world, completely divorced from what we've seen before. And eventually, slowly it dawns on us that Abby's father was a doctor, that he was a Firefly doctor, and that he was killed in the events of the first game. Holy shit! It's not a side story, it is a direct sequel. And then we kill Joel. The second half of the game is then the 3 days in Seattle as we slowly realize that Ellie is coming after us. We know something Abby does not, we know why this is all happening, but we've spent so much time with Abby before the knowledge of Joel's murder even comes into play that our loyalties become divided. The game ends at the end of Act 2, with the boss fight against Ellie and Abby letting her go. Abby's arc is complete, Ellie is alive, 95 on Metacritic, one of the best bait and switches in recent gaming memory. Then the third game, to wrap out the trilogy, is as Ellie, flashback seeing her side of the 3 days in Seattle, with the core of her game being the third act just extended. We see the rage and vengeance completely consume her, and because we didn't spend so much time with this rage previously, it still feels fresh and painful. Her throwing away the grace of life that Abby gave her is now less of a convenience to make the plot continue, but an exploration of the blinding grief that I don't think the game proper delved into well enough. It becomes a game not about revenge, but about the absolute horror that revenge turns you into. Ellie has gone from companion to villain to hero, and Abby's switch in the player's eyes from hero to villain complicates that. Ellie's forgiveness is no longer a retread of Abby's story, but something new. There's been time between the titles to process it, to reflect on the game's themes, so when we're dropped into this, we feel the harrowing heartbeat of the story the entire time. Ellie gives up her entire life for this hopeless pursuit. Fight in the water, Ellie lets Abby go, and her arc is finally complete. 99 on Metacritic, sucks to suck Ocarina of Time. I know that there are a multitude of problems with this idea, and it doesn't even come close to fixing everything I didn't care for in The Last of Us Part 2. In fact, it takes away a lot of the things I really did love about this game. But something about this game stoked an intellectual fire in me that few AAA games have ever come close to, and I wanted to both celebrate that and challenge it, and see if I could conjure an alternate universe version of the game's events that I personally felt greater exemplified what I found to be the game's most interesting and powerful set of ideas. If you have an idea how you would restructure The Last of Us, leave it in the comments. The structure of this game leaves a lot of room for potential ideas, so if you have one, say it. My reading is no more valid than yours, it's just a bit of analysis and a bit of fun, and if the entire video was spent equally on other contradictory pitches, then I would no longer be the protagonist of this video. And as we've seen, I don't know if that would work particularly well.